All right. So my name is John Linden. I was a former studio head at Activision, so I ran some big games called Call of Duty, Skylanders, some groups like that. A new company called Mythical Games. I'm not really here to talk as much about Mythical Games, but more about kind of what we see in kind of the mainstream games, at least in the West, and kind of see where we see that going. So I want to kind of focus on what we call player-owned economies, which kind of follows up on what Malcolm was talking about a little bit before this. So I've had the kind of honor to work on some really great games, and these games some of these have made a lot of money, but they don't necessarily have longevity, and that's one thing that we always looked at is like what creates longevity in games. You know, it's not necessarily dollars in revenue doesn't necessarily always kind of correlate back into longevity. So we started looking at games that do have longevity and what's kind of the common theme there, right? So if you look at things like Roblox has been around for nearly 15 years. Second Life is still actually generating profit 16 years later, which is kind of amazing. But they still have an audience that's playing the game nearly 2 decades later. So as we start looking at the trends here, what we saw is that a lot of it is really much about being player driven, right? So making sure the games have the opportunity for players to kind of create their own narrative, to create their own kind of competitions, things like that, tournaments, all that. So that was kind of a big piece we saw. And where we kind of saw then next is we started looking at, we've seen this bigger kind of role that players want to play, right? And I think one thing that we get a lot is when people find out you're on Call of Duty or something like that, they're like, when I grow up, I want to be a game designer. And while I don't think they actually want to be game designers, I think that what they do want is they want to have a bigger role in these games. So one thing we looked at is, we're sitting on this massive kind of $140 billion industry, but on top of that, basically what's happening is every time we've let players or content creators kind of adjacent to the industry, these multi-billion-dollar industries emerge, which is pretty fascinating. Content streaming with Twitch and with YouTube and some groups like that are now $5 billion. Esports is $1 billion, soon to be $2 billion, and that's not even in the game itself. So we started then looking at what are other things our players are doing, right? What are trends we've been seeing for the last 10 or 20 years? The first one is modding. We've seen this. I'm not sure why people would want to bring in Toy Story into Grand Theft Auto, but they do, right? So they want to bring their own content into these worlds, and I think it gives them this ability to have kind of control on where control in these worlds that they're spending a lot of time in. The other piece then we started looking at is farming, which I think Oscar just mentioned was some ideas around like people farming gold in World of Warcraft, selling it on eBay. That breaks pretty much every EULA in existence, but people still find a way to do it. All right, there's Malcolm. I was just looking for you over here. So there you are. So we started looking at these trends, and what we saw is that obviously game developers don't always like the modding necessarily. They're open to it, but there's not a great revenue stream or a formalized revenue stream out of that. Obviously, when you sell kind of these items outside of their channels, you lose control. And we kind of look back at the game economies, right? And the game economies really haven't shifted much at all, to be real honest. Like in the last 20 years, it's still kind of a one-way street of players buying intangible assets from game developers. And I think what we're starting to see the trend of is kind of what we're all here to talk about, is kind of the ability to have these new player-owned economies to where a portion of your players can become content creators in the game, brands can become players or contributors into the game, esports teams, influencers, things like that can actually become content creators and actually start partaking in that game economics themselves. And we think there's a lot of benefits to that, and it's a pretty fast topic we'll talk about here, but if you want to talk further, I can do that. So obviously digital ownership tech is pretty close to being ready. I think Malcolm has a great example of that as well, but we are also using the EOS blockchain right now. We think it's just, honestly, there's one main reason we're using it. Well, there's a couple reasons. One is the transaction fee, the way it's set up is pretty transparent, and we love the way it's kind of set up right now in terms of not having gas fees kind of to users and consumers. But more importantly, what's great is we can actually stake that on behalf of users. So we don't have to have the consumers interact directly. We can do a lot of that work behind the scenes. The next one is obviously having standards. So as you start exchanging and trading and selling game assets, you need to have a way to describe those assets, especially if you're bringing them outside of the game engines, right? There's a lot that goes into making an item look like an item. Are you guys familiar with the game Borderlands, right? I don't know if, yes, okay. Borderlands has a very cool cel-shaded look, right? It looks like a comic book. It's a 3D game that looks like a comic book. That's so much of that is done in the game itself, right? It's not just a 3D asset that makes it look like that. There's shaders, there's lighting, there's idle animations, there's all this stuff that makes those items look right. So if you're gonna start bringing these items outside a game, you have to have these standards to kind of show what does that item look like when you take it outside of the game. So those standards are kind of rolling out. We're involved in one called D-Goods for digital goods that you can find more information on dgoods.org. But we've actually been working very heavily with this standard and kind of getting it to be widely adopted. And then obviously having secondary markets. So similar to things like WAC, contracts. There's some other ones out there as well, but having the ability to have the ability to trade these is very, very important. So what's great is these things are all starting to happen, right? And we've seen this a lot in the last 12 months, and that's kind of an exciting time. DGoods, again, I won't mention. If you want to look up some information on this, you can go to dgoods.org. But again, the ability right now is to have these assets appear outside of the game as well as inside the game and have them be consistent. So we started looking at things like the blockchain games, right? And I hope we eventually drop this as a genre of names of blockchain games. It's just, they're games, right? But what we did see is kind of in these early kind of, what I consider still kind of the academic phase of this industry, what we saw is a couple of interesting things. Obviously, new models around digital ownership are fascinating. I mean, anybody that sees that a digital 2D cat can sell for 115,000 US, pretty fascinating. That's pretty amazing that someone spent that type of money, right? So that should wake up a lot of people and say, holy shit, there's some really amazing stuff happening in this area. The other one I love seeing is Gaza Unchained, I think, did a great job of this. A group out of Australia, having the ability to do pre-sales. For a lot of developers, if you're on the Activision or EA side, you probably have funding on your game. You don't necessarily have to think about building that community ahead of time. But for an indie game developer, this is very, very powerful to have kind of the community interacting with your game and possibly even spending money with your game before the game comes out. This is a great way to start funding the games. And I think these new concepts around digital ownership start making that a lot more feasible than just a normal, like a Kickstarter or a Fig or something like that. And then the last one we've looked at too is what this is. I think you could argue there's not necessarily enough data to make a big case on this, but one thing we have seen is that the ARPU and the RPPU of these games so far are incredibly high. Like they're literally 60, 70, 80 times what you see in a free-to-play game. So this is amazing. Even CryptoKitties is not necessarily the biggest one anymore, but they're still making like $15 per day per user, which is just astronomical numbers, right? So what we love is the idea that as we kind of roll some of these concepts into bigger mainstream games, when you have millions and millions of players, you're probably not going to see $15 a day per user still, but hopefully you'll see a lot higher economic trends than we saw in some of the other genres of games. So I think the big thing I want to kind of make sure everybody looks at and thinks about is that the way we kind of view blockchain is not necessarily, to us, blockchain is not a way of life. It's not it's really a palette of tools, right? So it's just like any other tool you'd have as a game developer, just like you'd have a physics engine or an audio pipeline or networking for multiplayer. It's a palette of tools to do what you want with. And I think that's one thing we've seen. So there's ideas, obviously, of having these smart contracts. It's a palette of tools. How do you want to design that for your game? How do you use those to kind of make that happen? Token economics, I think, are fascinating. We're not necessarily playing in the token economics side right now. We're playing on the asset side, so we're basically writing assets to the chain. We're not necessarily taking payments in cryptocurrencies yet, but there are some amazing token economic pieces that I think as they develop a little bit more will be very cool for gameplay, right? So things like mining coins in a game and having that verified, having dividend producing tokens, the longer you hold or stake your tokens, things can happen. So again, this is not necessarily our focus, but I think there's some really cool things that'll come out of this over the next few years, and they're already starting to hit. This is a big one for us though, is that gaming first, blockchain second. So I've done a couple of these talks before, and I think blockchain is fantastic. I think it's a great piece of technology. But frankly, if your game sucks, it's going to suck with blockchain. And I think that's something to keep in mind, right? Is that blockchain is not going to save a game. I think we've seen a lot of people are like, oh, I'm just going to put it on the blockchain. It'll be great. We'll have a big community of users. If your game's terrible, it's not going to be good with blockchain either. And I think that's a very, very important piece to keep in mind. So we are 100% focused on this trend. We're basically focused on building a couple pieces of tech around game economics, around some content creation, and obviously the D-goods. And then basically we're going to be putting out a couple games ourselves. Mostly, we wanted to see what a game looked like from the ground up if everything in the game was player-owned, right? What does that look like and how does that work? We're also going to be licensing the tech to some other game developers, and I think you're starting to see, there's a question earlier about some of the big studios. The big studios are listening. The big studios are talking. They're really starting to think about this, and they're thinking about it for a lot of different reasons. Actually, I'll do a quick follow-up on that question. I think it was you had that question earlier. There's some of the things that they're looking at that's not necessarily just the Diablo real cash market that happened before. And actually, if you looked at what Diablo did with Activision, or Activision Blizzard a while back, it actually financially was a big success. The Diablo marketplace on the real cash auction, I can't remember what they called, real money auction, they made a lot of money on that. It just wasn't designed kind of properly around the game flow that made that sustain. So they are starting to think about that. I think they're starting to think about that in terms of loyalty and things like that. You want to go ahead and ask? What's up?
Sorry to interrupt, but that real cash marketplace actually got Diablo banned in a couple of
It could, yeah, and that's that. I'll talk about regulations in a second. There's some really serious regulations you have to be careful of. There's a lot of ways to break gambling laws in this business if you're not careful on what you're doing, and I completely agree with that. So I think, again, I don't think I have a ton of time here, but I want to go through a couple things. This true digital ownership, this is probably the most exciting piece we love and why we're focused around this area. The ability to have secondary markets and access to secondary markets in games, I think is really, really fascinating. The reason we like it, though, is really what changes in game economies, right? The ability to have this tool set to where some of your assets are sold primary and some of them are sold secondary. What that starts doing is it starts introducing a lot of things you couldn't do before, right? You can, so I'm going to use a Western company. I don't know if it translates here, but Supreme, is Supreme a big company over here? I don't know on the East. Supreme, okay. Anyway, they sell a lot of their items. They'll sell Saturday morning for 2 hours, right? If they sell 100 or 200, they're fine with that because they created the ultimate rarity around their fashion line, right? You can start doing things like that in video games, which I think are fascinating, to where suddenly you can have an item that only sells 200, but if there's a secondary market component to it, those 200 are going to skyrocket on the secondary market, and if there's ways for the game developers and the content creators to monetize off the secondary markets, you start getting some really cool pieces and a lot of interest in these brands. So we love this idea, and I think we're literally at the 0.1% of what you can do with these concepts. The ability to engage a new group of players. This is one we love as well. So my last game I did was a game called Marvel Strike Force, which is a free-to-play mobile game. And the game did very well. We did about $200 million off that game in the first year. We were top 25 mobile game. What we found, though, is even doing well and having those type of numbers off this game, that was 5% of our players. And we were actually super happy that we converted 5%, right? Which means 95 out of 100 players never touched our commerce system. They never spent $1 in our game, which is great because we still like those users. They still are a very important part to the ecosystem, but they didn't pay us anything, right? So what happens now in this new world to where you're a player, you're part of that 95%, and you're grinding that game. You play that game all the time, you get something really cool, you customize it, you have something amazing, and somebody offers you $20 for that item, or $30 for that item. What happens to that user? Do they take the money and run? Do they reinvest it now back in the game? So this is one of the things I think is going to be really powerful with these new concepts, is you're going to be able to split out into kind of these new segments now of having, not only do you have the kind of casual users and your whales and your hardcore users, but you also now have your traders and you have your entrepreneurs and you have all these new categories of users within your world to do something with. And I think that's one thing we're very, very excited to see happen. The engaging pre-sales, I talked about this a little bit before. I think this is amazing. I also think this is very dangerous. I think if you do this, you have to think about it very, very thoroughly in terms of what does that look like, especially if you have your assets that are trading ahead of the game. You can do some really terrible things to your game economy as well, right? If those assets you're hoping to sell for $10 are now trading at 5 cents, you could destroy that economy. But if you do it right and you think through it, you can actually have a lot of really amazing things to where players are engaging or even financially engaging in your game because there's real assets there before the game even comes out. I think that's a really interesting place to play. And then, as I mentioned before, I think these new game economies are just fascinating. So the ability to have esports teams that are now selling items in your game, or esports teams that are not only just selling items in your game, but they have certain items they're giving out for free because now they can monetize that when they sell them from player to player. Or the esports players themselves have a one-of-a-kind, right? They have one thing that nobody else in the world has. So if you want to see that player, you're going to be seeing content you can only see from that streamer. Those are amazing sets of tools for game developers to utilize, right? So those are things we get very, very excited about. And kind of when you start tying these all together, I think it's going to basically take over a lot of gaming on basically all aspects of gaming in the future. The regulations, I think somebody mentioned this, you mentioned this earlier. Very, very serious. You have to really think through this. One thing to keep in mind, especially if you combine some basic pieces that are out there right now. The idea of saying, okay, I'm going to have someone buy a loot box, which is a blind object, right? And they don't know what they're going to get, but they're going to roll that dice and they're going to get something unique, or not even something unique. They're just going to get something potentially rare. And then we're going to have a secondary market so they can immediately sell that. That's gambling in just about every country in the world. So you have to be very careful around how you kind of build these economies. So if you do play in the space, stay close to regulations, kind of watch what's happening. The cool thing about that, there's a lot of ways around that. There's a lot of ways to do it right. You can have skill-based, you can have things that aren't necessarily, you can buy it, you have to level it up. You have to basically have a lot of different things around that. But I think that is one thing, I think that was a great point earlier. If you do play in this space, there's a lot of great new tools, but there's also a lot of regulation you have to kind of make sure you're kind of following. We are kind of working, like I said, we're working on a game called Blanco's Block Party. We're actually going to be releasing a console and PC game. So big platforms. We're working with a lot of the big first parties right now to basically do a combination of having kind of a high fidelity game. Everything in the game is owned by players, and everything is, is tradable, is kind of ownable by the players. Can have secondary markets. You can trade them, you can customize them, you can sell them. But what's great is we've actually been able to work through that with the big first parties, and I think that's very, very exciting to see that happen. We'll be launching this game a little bit, probably the next. I won't freak out my marketing team and give a date, but we will be going into a beta before too terribly long. So if you want more information on that, that's at Blanco's. It's kind of some shots from our game, but we're kind of combining kind of a AAA feeling game with these secondary market concepts, and we're quite excited around that. That's my talk. So thank you very much. I'll open it to questions.
Yep. Thank you very much, John. That was fantastic.
Yeah.
I think it's amazing when you get someone John's background who's experimenting all the time with new things to see kind of where you're taking, and to actually take this AAA kind of mindset into kind of mainstream with blockchain, for me, is fascinating. So here's your chance to ask him questions. Anyone got a question? Or shall I start? So, I mean, what's the biggest challenge, particularly, I think, with the question that was raised earlier? The regulation balance is something that's really tricky, and as we know, skill-based gaming is a perfectly legitimate thing, but there's this point where whether it's real gambling or just perceived gambling, depending on the audience, there's a real fine line about where those lines are drawn. How do you draw those lines? Where do you stop and where do you think?
Yeah, so I think, again, it depends on per game, right? Just like anything in a game, there's not a formula for every game. One thing we're looking at, and this is something I can share, is that we're looking at kind of changing the economy a little bit, and because we have these set of tools, right? So what I mean by that is that we're not doing loot boxes. You can see everything in our game. But we are doing a lot of time-based type assets, as I mentioned. So we're kind of taking that sneakerhead, that new Nike model, and kind of applying that into the video game world. So there'll be some things that'll only be for sale for 2 hours, and you'll never be able to get it again. Some things will be for sale for a week. Some will be for a month. And what you start seeing these differences between items. If an item's for sale for a month or 3 months or an entire season or forever, your primary sales will be high, but your secondary sales are not going to trade that often. But you can see a kind of a combination of that. And what we're seeing is that different brands, different groups, different constituents have different interests in those. And being able to kind of mix those together get very fascinating. But we are kind of eliminating the idea of loot boxes. We have no loot boxes in our game, which helps kind of with some of those regulations, and probably helps with that helps with the industry in general, right? I think the loot box craze is very dangerous. It's very addictive. It's a very tough one to do. Now, I'm not saying that a FOMO type model is going to be less addictive, but I do think it's kind of shifting some of those things and avoiding some of the regulation issues.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the key things about kind of randomized rewards is a very positive and good thing. Yeah. It's when they can be cashed out, and of course now we're talking about blockchain, they can be, and so I think thinking differently. What was also interesting for me was some of the uses of people. You don't do the asset thing, but if you look at the commodities, the resources in a game currently aren't something that we'd see a lot of people playing with in terms of blockchain. But I think the potential for that to be able to sort of effectively add kind of democratic kind of motion to the way a game is balanced is a fascinating game problem.
I do. I think there's a line on that too. I mean, so I've heard of some people that are like, well, it'd be great about using blockchain is that all the decisions can be made by the token, right? So you vote with your token and it changes the game. Maybe. I like that to some degree, but I think in other cases, if you look at most of the big IPs kind of around the world, everything is there's visionaries behind these worlds. There's people that live in these worlds and create these worlds. So I think having influence in the governance of a game is really powerful. Having it decided completely by the community, I think, could be a recipe for disaster outside of a couple of games. But I do think there's this type of technology behind the scenes enables those things to happen very easily.
Yeah, I think we've seen game design as economists for a while already, and let alone in free to play, it's a whole order of magnitude difference.
Community as an economist is a little scary.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
So unless anyone's got a last question, I will say thank you very much, John.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.